Hi and hello watch fans, and welcome to another edition of the Real Time Show. With us, your in-house provocateur David Vaucher, calling in from Fontainebleau, and me, your friendly neighborhood jeweler, Alon and Joseph, dialing in from my beloved Amsterdam. How are you, David?
Doing well. Bonjour, Alon. Bonjour, tout le monde. You know, it's always a good day when I get to log on here and talk watches with you. So looking forward to this episode.
So do I. It's always fun to jam with you. Our mailbag has been filled again nicely. One of our newest listeners who reached out to us through the contact form is Bernd. Bernd wrote to us, a few weeks ago, I started to listen to some of your recent episodes. Great show. Jumped right to the top of my favorite watch podcasts. Thank you, Bernd. That is exactly what we want to hear. And thank you for reaching out. His question. First things first. You are recently bringing up gold watches and what listeners' suggestions for a great gold watch would be. Well, my first choice, and it's actually on my list, will be the Grand Seiko Quartz 9587-8010. There you have it. No need to look any further. Which gold watches, if any, would you be tempted to buy on the current market at retail? And if there aren't any or many, which vintage pieces would you be inclined to pursue? So thank you, Bernd. David, the honor is yours to kick off with your answer. I know you have a two-tone one. Do you aspire to wear a full gold watch?
Ooh, man, yeah, I think there's an article just in the, do you like two-tone or not? Just right there. And off the bat, I'll say I do. You know, I'm a product of the 80s and my dad had a two-tone watch. So it doesn't shock me at all. It's just, I like it. But if we're talking full gold, you know, I think the choice of a Seiko Quartz as a full gold watch is really interesting because there's a juxtaposition there of something that people don't associate with very expensive with something that is, which is gold. And I have to be careful because obviously Seiko Quartz is not quartz as we know it. I mean, the whole package is high end. I suppose if I were thinking of gold, one of the first reasons that I have not bought one, let's obviously set aside costs because I think, you know, it's an obvious consideration, but let's just set that aside. A big consideration, and Alon, I'd love to hear your point of view from Amsterdam because I've heard a lot of stories, is safety. You know, where I live in Fontainebleau, I kind of take for granted my safety, but going beyond that, I would hesitate. So I think that to put so much money into something I hesitate to wear is a little bit sad. So then let's just kind of set that aside and assume that's not an issue. What you want to do is have a watch where you're not just buying like the gold for the gold's sake, if that makes sense. It has to add something to the watch. So when you talk about a Submariner, and then you talk about a gold Submariner, it's not really a tool anymore, but there's something about a gold Submariner where you think, this makes no sense at all, but this is really, really, really fun. And so if I were buying gold, it would have to be something that's fun. So I tend to buy very practically. And gold, to be honest, you know, Alon, maybe you have something to add here, but it's not a very practical material. Like if you're looking for specs and strength and hardness, gold's actually pretty terrible. It's heavy and it's soft. It just doesn't do what stainless steel and titanium do. So if I were buying a gold watch, I think it would have to be something where it was just over the top, super fun, and like it just ties into the whole package. So maybe after we're finished recording, I will have a different answer. But Alon, you know me, I love Hublots, so I'm just gonna say like, give me the full gold, you know, Hublot Big Bang chronograph, and that'll be the one for me. What do you think?
Bam! That's a curveball. That one I didn't expect. Cool pick. It underlines the fact that you love Hublot. So, very cool. Now, question for you. And probably you've addressed it in your article. But assuming I didn't read or heard it, is a two-tone a poor man's gold watch? Or does it add a bit of bling to a steel watch? why do you think they ever made two-tone watches?
Ah, man, that's a good question. I can't put myself in the shoes of whoever first came up with that. It's a look, I mean, okay, it's less expensive. Sure, it is. But I think that if you opt for the two-tone, you're opting for a look, right? Because, like I used to be quite tanned and I'm not anymore because I work from home, like whatever, I stay home a lot. And I just don't know that gold goes with my skin tone very well. And I'm sure I'm not the only one that thinks that. So if you buy two-tone, you're sort of cutting that edge off a little bit. And you're buying a look, you're buying a vibe. Like I don't associate it with the 80s, but if one did associate it with, for example, Miami Vice, then they get to have some of that magic. Like in my case, actually, my personal story with two-tone is my dad worked for an oil company. And, if you drive around Houston, certain parts of Houston anyways, it's just very common. It's called the Texas Timex. And that's a vibe. Whether it's one I want to create all the time, not necessarily, but I don't think, okay, Alon, this as well as anyone, like you should never, and I'm sure you tell this to your customers, you should never buy something as a substitute for something else. So if you really are buying a two-tone watch because the gold is unattainable, save your money, look on the used market, do whatever you have to, get the gold. But it's a look by itself. And so if you like two-tone and that's your thing, then you should absolutely go for it.
Probably Bernd clicked on one of my comments about really wanting a gold watch, and the discussion that I have perpetually with my brother. He actually purchased a vintage Rolex day date. So we're talking about the 36 vintage ones. I want a champagne gold dial. He wants a white one, Roman numerals. I want indexes or a stone dial. So he actually pulled the trigger on that. So I've said it on air. That's one of the highest ones on my list. So that's vintage. Now, in modern era, I've said on air that I really contemplated wearing a full gold Omega Speedmaster or a Zenith Chronomaster Sport gold. So that's where I am at right now. Good news is in today's market, it's very much more obtainable to get a gold watch because prices came down hard, and the ones that get hit the hardest are the gold pieces. And for a few months now, you're hearing more and more, and I've encountered it myself. It's possible to get discounts on new Rolexes at the Rolex ADs, and you can guess which ones. It's the gold pieces. So for everybody on the fence, it's becoming a buyer's market. And regarding your Grand Seiko, Bernd, you're a baller that you've chosen a quartz. I have to admit, my knowledge of Grand Seikos is not enough. So I had to Google the 9587. I love it. It's stealth. It's gold with a champagne dial. Total cool watch. So good on you. And I really hope that you'll get it soon. And make sure to join the TRTS community where you will share your wrist shot with that watch on.
Yeah, actually, Alon, if I could just add, because see, this is, you always say the show is dangerous because it just kind of brings up more ideas, in your mind. I would say that, I said it was like at the end of the show, I'm going to have a different answer. Well, you actually just said the two ones that I think would have come to mind, which would be basically the president, which I would buy just to celebrate like being awesome at life, right? And I don't usually think that about myself, but if I'm buying a president, it's because I've done something awesome. And I want to remind myself of that. And I think that a gold Speedmaster, that is awesome. I don't know that it's something that would be the first choice to go to space, but Speedmasters are great. Gold looks super nice. So gold Speedmaster, do it. But yeah, I'd love to see a picture of your president when you finally get it. That sounds like a fantastic watch. Let's go ahead and move to another question. I'm going to put my unwatched wrist into the virtual mailbag here. We have a question from one of our readers, or our listeners, sorry, Lawrence Van Hove. And I apologize, Alon, if I have mispronounced that. Lawrence asks, where on the wrist should you wear your watch? I see Patrick and you wearing on the wrist bone. I did that way till my brother corrected me approximately 10 years ago. So, Alon, you are an expert watch wearer. What do you think?
Lawrence Van Hove, thank you for the question. and we actually share a bit of roots. So I will say Lawrence June, Baba June. Your brother did not correct you because there is no correct way. Okay? You do you. You should wear your watch however you feel comfortable. Maybe your brother refers to the fact that back in the day, there was more elegance, more style. There was no flexing, and you need to be more elegant. So you would wear your watch under your cuff and you wouldn't flash or flaunt your watch. In that case, they usually say you wear the watch behind the wrist bone towards your biceps, and so not towards your hand. Today, everybody wears their watches rather loose, and the watch dangles on your hand instead of on your wrist. Probably that's what he and you are referring to. Me, myself, I also think it depends on your biology and your build. So if I don't wear a metal bracelet, I usually wear it behind my bone as well. With my shirts, I usually have the cuff made a bit wider on the left where I wear my watches. So I have the ability to wear it under a cuff. But as a jeweler, obviously I need to show my watch all day long, and as a watch nerd as well. So I wear it up and down. If I have a metal bracelet, I tend to wear it looser because I don't like things too tight on my skin or my wrist. And then it will literally slide up and down. And obviously, your hand and wrist swell during the day, irrelevant of temperature or locations where you are, or if you work out or not. And that's why the beauty of the arrival of micro adjustments in metal bracelets, which took the brands quite some time to achieve that, are a huge, huge savior, because some customers that I know simply had to return their watches because there were no half links in metal bracelets. Take, for example, the previous Omega Speedmaster. So with the 1861 caliber, for that bracelet, they literally didn't have a half link. So that was really a pain in the ass. So that's how I wear my watches. How do you wear your watches, David?
Well, I think, good for you, Alon, for just stating right off the bat, there is no right way. Because if I'd have gone first, I think I might have said, well, this is how you should wear your watch. But yeah, you're right. Ultimately, everyone should just do what's most comfortable for them. Speaking personally, I cannot stand to have loose watch. The micro adjustment obviously is a huge innovation, but that doesn't stop the fact that whenever you first get a watch, it's usually coming with 3-4 extra links at least. So my first stop is always either to my desk if it's screws, or to the local jeweler if it's collar and pin. I'd rather have it, in fact, a little too tight rather than having it flop around. I think there might be a little bit of a broader discussion here. I certainly wasn't thinking this way when we first thought about what we were going to talk about for the show, but the loose watch trend, there's a joke, and it's not really a joke, it's the truth, is like watches are man jewelry. Now, clearly everyone can wear a watch, but if you look at kind of, I would say, conventional codes, a watch is one of the few pieces of jewelry that men will wear, and that's loosening, right? And so if you look at a lot of the stars who have many watches, you see them on Instagram, it's almost like the watch is jewelry, because it's like it's like a bracelet or a cuff that you might sell in your store, Alon, right? And I can definitely see that being looser. So I think maybe it's related to that. The other thing too, and I'm kind of mixing demographics here, and I'm doing that because I'm really asking the question, but if you look at trends for clothing, so I've been into clothes, most of my life. I know, Alon, you've been into sneakers we probably started liking, our respective clothes and sneakers around the same time. But when I was growing up, Tommy Hilfiger, Ralph Lauren, Nautica, the trend was very baggy. And as I became a professional and an adult and had to start wearing more formal clothing, that for me happened during the Mad Men era. So skinny suits, skinny ties, and I don't think you will ever see me changing. And you were not going to see, what were they pushing back then? Like a Tissot Viso Day or a JLC Reverso. That was not going to be hanging off people's wrists. Now, as those clothing codes have really kind of evolved, and now anyone can do anything, which I think is great. you see a return to some of those looser fits, right? Looser tops, looser pants. And I suppose that in that respect, it would kind of break the silhouette if you had a super tight watch. So just to summarize that, I would say that it's probably going to depend on the type of watch. So if you are wearing a Patek or a JLC, that's probably going to be on a strap. It will probably be, relatively fitted. But I think at the same time, like just given how things are evolving, I'm not surprised that there is this move back towards a little bit of a preference for looser wearing watches.
Yeah, interesting. So yeah, you see trends in fashion. I don't know if you really can extrapolate it to the watches in way of wearing baggy clothing versus skinny fit. And that, I think that people tend to wear it looser as it links to flexing culture. And what you said, rightfully so, if it's a jewel, then you'll wear watches on a metal bracelet, especially gold watches on gold bracelet, more as a bangle or a bracelet or as a jewel. So yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you so much, David. Interesting link to fashion. Going from fashion to trends of the industry and more on the financial side of things. Jacques Jardin, JJ, sent us a message on LinkedIn. And he asks, what do you think of the current state of the industry? After seeing all the financial results from the big groups, especially Swatch Group tanked hard, what do you think about it? And why have they specifically suffered so much?
Oh,
what are you two cents on that topic? And both topics, actually, David.
Okay. Man, I feel like, Alon, we're going to make up the balance of the episode, maybe just talking about this. There is a lot to unpack here. So I don't have any data in front of me. I'm just going off of what I have read. And so I'm going to go off of memory here and say that I do remember, in fact, that the Swatch Group's results were disappointing, I think we'll say. I don't know how much. I think it was a very strong fall in revenue, but I think people were disappointed with Swatch Group. I know that recently LVMH has been affected. They had a fall in revenues. I don't recall Richemont's results, but I think generally we can definitely summarize like, okay, results came in and they were underwhelming. There's a couple things to consider here. First is that we are on the back end of, I think we're well out of it now, but as everyone listening to this show knows, there was a huge increase in the interest in watches during COVID. And as the pandemic has receded, as people have options to spend their money elsewhere, and as I've talked about before, as just life gets more expensive and as the industry tends to focus on a narrower set of people, there is less interest in buying those watches through the traditional channels. So I think the first thing we have to discuss, and I don't think I have an answer because, again, I don't have data in front of me, is this a true like collapse, if we can call it that? Or is it just a reversion to historical trends? In other words, like in a world where COVID, didn't happen, are we now back to where things would have been after just, 3 or 4 years of growth? So maybe, Alon, let's just pause there. Like, what do you think? What do you think of that? I mean, based on what you're seeing on the ground, are we actually talking like the industry is losing ground, or is this just kind of turning back to how things would have been if it hadn't caught fire over the last couple of years?
So very interesting question. And maybe before I answer that, to create a bit of context and benchmarking. So Richemont did a minus 13% in turnover. Swatch Group got hit very hard. They went down in turnover about almost 20%. I believe it was something like 19%. And their profits went down by almost 80%, 70 something. They're still profitable. Half year figures, 2024. So, and I did a deep dive because I do consultancy, both strategy, marketing, product development for luxury brands, including watch and fine jewelry brands. But I also do very top level financial consultancy for investment groups that invest in the luxury industry. So it's interesting to do these mental exercises as well. So because of that, I literally did some research. Swatch Group also went down in margin. So they went from a regular 19% to an operational margin of 11%. Whereas we say in the industry, a good level is 25, and exceptional is 30. So Swatch was already below par on that. They also always speak about the effect of currency, and that's maybe something you can add. I find it weird that these publicly listed companies that we're talking billions, Swatch Group, if I remember correctly, does about 8 billion turnover a year. They don't hedge the financial forex exposure that they have. They do obviously a lot of, they're in Switzerland, so they have an exposure Swiss franc to all other currencies. And what currencies are important to them? First market is US, so US dollars. Japan is very important to them. So the Japanese yen, which tanked hardcore. But the exposure that they had was 3.6%. You have to imagine they lost 145 million Swiss francs just on exposure of Forex. And that I can't comprehend, because that you should hedge out. I mean, obviously you can't create always a zero-sum game on foreign exchange rates, but 3.6 sounds for me that the CFO needs to be replaced. But that's a side note. We see obviously a hardcore dependency on China, which went down. They have been moving upmarket on monobrand boutiques. Obviously, that's a topic dear to my heart. And that was my first article that aired a while ago on the Real Time show. And what's very important, they keep on mentioning the moon swatch in their financial results, how important that is. And to put that into perspective, they sold 2 million moon swatches. And if the going rate is around 250 in whatever currency, we're talking about 500 million of their turnover being just these moon swatches. And those are sold solely in their own boutiques. That means the full margin goes to the Swatch Group and Swatch brand. So we're talking about 80% margin. If you extrapolate that or deduct that, let's say this is a drug or a vitamin you're taking, and these sales are done because you hear noises on the ground that everybody's fed up. Everybody says, Swatch, pull the plug already on these moon swatches. And if that happens, or they die out, or they fizzle out, or they don't sell anymore, what does that do to the financial results of the Swatch Group? So these are little things that worry me. We always see a downturn. To answer your specific and very valid question, are we going back to normal figures? I would say kinda. Apparently, Rolex has stated that their profit went down by 20%. So that says that something's going on. But we come from an extreme high. Not an extreme high, an all-time high. The Swiss watch industry has never, ever produced as much. And more importantly, it's not so much about quantity, but value. They've never sold so much. That being said, we have to remember all these Swiss export data that we have at hand, which is public data, is sell in to the retailers, their own monobrand retail of the brands. But of course, the wholesale part of it is going into retail. That doesn't mean that it ended up on consumers' wrists. So that's data that we don't have. Is this a good correction? I think so. We've been saying on the pod here that the market has gone in overdrive, and we even dare to use the word bubble. So it's a natural correction. It's an important correction. It's a necessary correction. I always couldn't understand why in the luxury industry, whenever the brands were talking about budgets, there's always a plus. Never, ever, ever a minus. These brands has never said, hey guys, the outlook is wrong. Let's do less this year. But if we study economics and history, everything is cyclical. Everything that goes up must come down. So how can it be that they always predict growth and then get shocked and punished by the financial markets because they didn't anticipate these down cycles? So now everybody is in shock that these luxury groups are projecting red figures and minuses and diminishing growths or declines or losses, whereas it's very logical. The world is on fire. We have 2 raging wars going on, huge elections going on. In Asia, obviously, there's a lot of tension and volatility, and that never came up since the COVID era. I mean, the middle class in China is suffering very much. There is less tourism. They want them to buy locally. Prices are high there. So, in a sense, I think, to answer your question, yeah, it's a good thing.
The currency effect is huge, Alon. That's right. The effect of a pullback from Chinese consumers is huge, although it's not the first time that's happened. That happened, I think, in the mid-2010s when they changed some of their gifting laws, and the industry recovered. You know, the question specifically, though, was what is the state of the industry at this point? And we've talked about this on the show before, Alon. To me, I think the industry has taken Jean-Claude Biver's insight of let's make watches a luxury, and I think doubled down on it to a point where it's not becoming healthy because, you know, we're talking about publicly traded companies here, right? But I think if you looked at Patek, my feeling is that they might be doing better. At least that's my sense. Hermes is publicly traded, obviously, but they are super, super high end. And from the headlines I've seen, they seem to be doing okay, or at least better than their other peers. And so what we saw at Watches and Wonders earlier this year, what we continue to see is that the aspirational consumer who might just want to treat themselves is being left behind. And more, it seems to me like the thesis behind some of these companies is we're going to sell the highest dollar watches possible to a very limited pool of people. And that pool of people, you know, maybe their resources are unlimited. I don't know. Maybe there are people for whom it's like, yeah, whatever. It's like, you know, buying a cup of coffee when they buy an MB&F or when they buy a, you know, pick your brand. But long term, I just don't think that's very sustainable. You know, one industry analyst, I'm sure you probably know, Alon, Oliver Mueller, he's, I think, Revolution's kind of go-to for analyzing the industry. And with regards to Swatch's results, he looked at what their inventories were and said, well, if you look at the at cost, you know, values of these inventories, they're actually like running several years worth of inventory. And my sense is that it's not just Swatch. I think there are a lot of brands who have a lot of inventory. And the last time this happened, the example I remember is Cartier. Like they almost couldn't give them away. They were buying them back to destroy them. This was, again, back in the 2010s. And we haven't gotten to that point yet. So if you ask me to characterize the industry currently, it would be in 2 ways. I think the first one is just it is bifurcated and focused on a group of people that I don't think allows for the long-term sustainability and growth of the industry. That's the first one. And the second thing I would say is that if you were looking for a bargain, you should keep waiting, because I think that the worst, unfortunately, is still to come. And if you take the counterpoint to that, then what you're saying is, well, I think the industry is due for an upswing, and we're not there yet. I don't know when that point is, but I think that there's still, unfortunately, more pain that brands are going to have to go through before they get to the other side. What do you think, Alon?
I think that we've definitely have not seen rock bottom. That was my prediction also, especially for the Swatch Group. There are a lot of things there in flux. What I've tried to explain to these financial institutions, they sometimes get confused about brands and groups. Meaning, you need to compare apples with apples and not apples with pears, and definitely not apples with oranges. Meaning, they have been thrown off by the fact that Swatch is a watch brand, and the financial holding, the group, has named their group after that particular brand. So they've sometimes mixed these two, and they've sometimes compare Swatch Group to just Cartier. So for our listeners that are maybe not that familiar with the groups, in our luxury industry, there are only a few that are still today independent, which are Patek Philippe, family-owned, family-run, just one brand. Rolex technically is not a group. It has become a group now. Why? The Hans Wilsdorf Foundation is technically family-owned, family-run, but because it's a foundation, people have no idea who the shareholders are, what turnover, what profits they make. They don't publish this data. They've always had the brand Tudor, so technically that makes them a little group. Since they've bought the retailer Bucherer, including the watch brand Karl F. Bucherer, they now have a retail arm, multi-brand, technically independent, and another watch brand. So they've become a little group. But okay, for argument's sake, we'll call Rolex an independent brand. Then you have Audemars Piguet, same story. The family Audemars is still running the show. Jasmine Audemars is on the board and is a unicorn. Unicorn companies are those that do $1 billion either turnover or market value or whatever you want to call it. And those are the big independents that are left. Let me rack my brain quickly if I forgot one. Technically, Hermes is one as well. And although they're trading publicly, Chanel as well, but that's slowly becoming a group. Then the biggest luxury group in the world is LVMH, Louis Vuitton, Hennessy, and Moet. So obviously, liquor side of things, fashion side of things, started buying watch brands like Tag Heuer, Zenith, Hublot, and Bulgari. They have Dior watches, they have Vuitton watches now, they have manufacturing capacities. They've just spun off Daniel Roth, Gerald Genta watch brand, and doing more and more in the watchmaking industry, bought Tiffany & Co. Mr. Arnault, the owner, the majority shareholder of the publicly trading Louis Vuitton, is still, I believe, the most wealthy person in the world. So think about that. He surpassed scalable business entrepreneurs like Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, Bezos, Jeff Bezos, Amazon, etc. So that's very interesting with an old school trade of things that are made by hand and that are definitely overpriced. He became very wealthy. So he's doing something right. Then you have Richemont, run and majority shareholders are the Rupert family from South Africa. They have brands like Cartier, Van Cleef & Arpels, but also IWC, Panerai, etc., and 12 or 13 more. These two groups, including Kering, the majority brand there is Gucci. They have less watch brands. They used to have Girard-Perregaux, Ulysse Nardin, etc. They let go of those brands. They run it like a financial holding. Although each maison, each brand has manufacturing capacities, it's not so much an industrialized group. They're financial holdings, meaning they give financial support, back office support, structural support, legal support, and maybe marketing support to their independent maisons. Swatch Group, however, majority shareholder are the Hayeks, and although they own around a quarter of the shares, they have a voting right of over 38%, which makes them the biggest and influential shareholder in that group, is a bit different. And that's what I also try to explain to these financial institutions that want to buy their shares and stocks. Swatch Group is very much industrialized. What do I mean by that? They came up by consolidating the Swiss watch industry, and the biggest gem in that portfolio was ETA. And all the manufacturing capacities with Piguet and La Nouveau Alemania, and etc. So Swatch Group came from an industrialization concept of sharing calibers, production capacities, and then clicked on brands from that very high end, being Breguet, Blancpain, Omega, going down to Longines, Tissot, Swatch, Flic Flac, and a few more brands. But that also is another important aspect. Besides being very much industrialized, they are the odd one out in these luxury groups because they are not, some call them snooty, in the sense that they only have hard luxury, high-end brands. They also have Swatch, Tissot, even Longines is not so much hard luxury, whereas the lowest brands within Richemont and LVMH, the lowest technically entry brand within Richemont is Bon Mercier. And for LVMH, I need to rack my brain, but technically those are the Quartz Dior watches if I need to pick one very quickly. And correct me if I'm wrong, David. So overall, they are a bit different. And because Swatch Group produces so much, that means they have way more inventory. They click back to your topic of inventory. So do you want to ping pong back on that before I ask my other question to you on this topic, David?
Alon, this is sort of what I thought is like we could talk for a very long time about this. There's a lot of directions to take this. One of the things that I just want to mention, and it's so important that I've actually just turned in an article to Rob about this, is that when you talk about important companies in the industry and this bifurcation of where brands are going, I think Swatch, again, is positioned to really save the business. So in the same way that the Swatch brand, so Swatch watches, sort of saved Switzerland during the quartz crisis of the kind of late 70s, early 80s. They are the only ones, and Alon, maybe you have a different view on this, but they are the only ones that have this mix of IP and industrial might and can do the things that they do. So, for example, like if the moon swatch, that was not happening anywhere else. And as much as some people might say, oh, it's tired, it's played out, hugely, hugely important. And in 30 years' time, we're going to look back on that as a milestone release. Then just amongst some of the brands that you said, like Longines, right? I mean, I know that back in the day, it used to be on par with Rolex, 13 ZN movements, all that. But at the same time, now there's still a very important watch to get people into watches. I think in Asia, they are hugely popular. And so what you have with Swatch is a company that can share these movements. They have an industrial kind of philosophy where things do get shared. And so you can produce very high quality watches for much less than if they were being produced anywhere else, if even at all. I mean, in LVMH, for example, I know it's a little different because the price tiers are higher. You don't want to be seen as just having one brand copy the other. But Swatch is hugely, hugely important. And so when you see things like inventories piling up and profits going down, I don't really see a world where Swatch doesn't exist. I mean, look, anything can happen. So maybe in 50 years' time, the Swatch group has dissolved and, LVMH owns Omega and, Longines just doesn't exist anymore and it gets resurrected by a micro brand, who knows? But I think Swatch has a very particular place in where the business is at now, because on one hand, it is extremely susceptible to the things that we just talked about, currency fluctuations, inventory buildups, but they're the ones that I think are going to help really propel the next phase of the industry. And the last point I'll make is that I think there's still some things to sort out, though, because, you talk about a missed opportunity. Alon, you mentioned Breguet and Blancpain. Like Swatch Group does very well at the more entry level tiers. Then you hit Omega, it becomes a little dicier, and then you hit Blancpain and Breguet, and it's like crickets almost. And so it's a shame that they couldn't have turbocharge the marketing, turbocharge the outreach when watches were on fire and just really kind of gotten something going for those brands. Because now when the industry seems to be relying on high-end watches, I don't think Breguet and Blancpain are part of the conversation. What do you think?
I kind of concur with you. For argument's sake, we have a lot of ground to cover because we actually have a question that links to this question, and I want to deal with that one in this episode. But before we do so, I'm actually very curious, and I've been meaning to ask you this quite some time. You're living in the US, you sound like an American. Why do you think the American market became the number one market for Swiss exports? And to link another question to that, and you can take it as an essay maybe, Do you think that the US can hold ground as being the number one market? And if so, how much growth potential is in that market, if you catch my drift?
Man, great questions. You know, I had a business school professor who always say, be careful not to base your answer on the data point of me, right? I'd love to have some more data, but I do know that what you said is true. According to the Swiss watch exports, and again, these are, like you said, sell in numbers and not sell through, but the US is the biggest market. And what I find interesting, and this is going to be the basis of my hypothesis, is that even just in my little town in France, right, there's like 15,000 people. It is not uncommon to see PRXs. It is definitely not uncommon to see moose watches. It's almost daily. And I think the stereotype to an extent is true. People here kind of grow up with a certain sense of style, and it's very accepted. Like, you do your, maybe not your first communion, but you graduate from high school, you do your exams, you get a nice watch. And I think that is part of the culture. In the US, obviously celebration, there's different events to celebrate, but I don't think I'm going out on a limb by saying that unless you're in some of the coastal cities like Los Angeles or New York, the fashion part is not really there. And so I don't often come across just people casually wearing what you call nice watches. When I'm talking about my experience in America now, it really does seem to be like the one person in oil and gas who has, the two-tone Rolex, or people who have a lot of disposable income and who are just buying watches because they're expensive. I don't know that it fits into a broader narrative of kind of how, and I have to be super careful how I say this, but it doesn't have the same context that the Europeans have when they go for these things. So to answer your question, Alon, I think right now it is the watch market seems to me, and I'm several years removed from living there, it seems to be an extremely good illustration of what we've talked about before, which is selling very expensive watches to a very small number of people. And as the conditions allowing for that monetary buildup, change, I think that's when we'll start to see that watch market change as well. So just, hypothetically, in a world where the dollar is not the world's reserve currency, for example, and again, just extremely hypothetically, that would have an effect. In a world where, the tech sector continues to pull back, that would have an effect. So I think you're looking at something fundamental has to change in the way the U.S. economy and market is set up. But I think the one thing I do feel confident in saying is that it is not the same context for buying and wearing watches here as it is in Europe.
Very interesting. So to create context, Apple apparently sells 37 million Apple watches, okay, a year. That's 2.5 times the whole total Swiss watch industry. Now, I'm stating that just to put things in perspective, because these Swiss watch brands, and especially these groups, think the world revolves around them and they're the center of the world. So that puts things into context and makes it relative. But I'm using this now for a different reason. I've been always told that the Apple Watch and the smartwatches is a good thing, especially in the US or North America, where it teaches people that usually don't put anything on their wrist to put something on the wrist. They're getting used to absorb time from the wrist. And at a certain point in their evolution, they want a real watch. That being said, a luxury watch or mechanical watch or something that's more classical than a smart watch. Do you A, think that's right? And B, could we say that the Western world, so the old world being Europe, was more educated, more accustomed to wearing watches because we're closer to the fire? And as you said, there's a gifting culture. As simple because education goes up in North America? Or do you see other factors?
Man, great. Great question. I think there's probably enough for a historical book here as well. What's wild as you were talking about this is that, the US was a hotbed, not of watch consumption. Yeah. But at end of the 19th century and early 20th century, watch manufacturing was huge in the US. I mean, you had like Waltham, you had Hamilton. IWC was set up actually by an American. Essentially, he went to Switzerland and started his watch adventure there. So clearly, there was something that just never picked up. I mean, as far as I understand things, up until probably the 60s or 70s, I think, watches were something you just wore as a tool. They weren't necessarily luxury items that people would wear. They just were tools, and you had your, neighborhood watchmaker. There were a lot more of them back then. And your watch was kind of like just an appliance that you would get serviced and fixed as you would your kind of washing machine or television or whatever. And it just seems like at some point that culture of wearing a wristwatch dropped off. It seems like, whereas in Europe, that which was, very used to kind of traditional markers of luxury and, maybe different social mores, like it seems like that was always there. And then, you fast forward, and I'm fast forwarding a lot here, and you get to the Apple Watch. And I would love to know the regional breakdown for those Apple Watch sales, because as much as I see nice watches or nicer watches on wrists here in Europe, I see almost no Apple Watches. It's not like I don't see any of them, but, and this, I know this is all very anecdotal, but I don't see them almost at all. Whereas when I come across, American tourists, or the few times I've gone back, the Apple Watch is huge. And again, I'm just speculating here. But it seems to me like, one thing that I do think Americans do well compared to Europe, or do differently if you want to be less subjective, is they're just super big on like tracking and maximizing everything. Like, what was my sleep like? How many steps did I take? Am I getting enough water or sunlight or whatever it is? And the Apple Watch is very good for that. And so I think it does so well there because it ties into this mentality that people have, which is just not shared as much by people in Europe. So if you look at it that way, I don't think that there's really a ton of ground to convert to a traditional watch, because if your selling point is the data and the stats, well, a mechanical watch is not really going to offer that to you. And so it seems to me like we have ended up almost where we started, where, yeah, there's something on people's wrists, but again, you're not really going to grow the pie, which is what I would love to see the industry do. And so you're just selling more and more expensive watches to the same, handful of people over and over again. What do you think, Alon?
I think we have enough content here for you to write a very interesting article about this. To write out this episode, Max Loyal from the TRTS Network asked something in the same vein. What's your feelings about the current landscape in the industry? Do you see brands' lack of reaction to this downturn as a sign the market will eventually rise up again? Or will the ignorance be a reason for their further downfall in the future? So, taking everything into consideration that we discussed, he asks basically two things. So let's dissect it. What, David, are your feelings about the current landscape? If we take a macro view on everything, you can take consumer behavior, you can see the prices on the secondary market, or action results, take it broader into fashion or the global economy. What's your feeling about current landscape? Just share feelings.
Changing. If you had to ask me one word, I'd say changing. And when I worked for a consulting firm, one of the partners would always say, I don't mind if things go down or they go up, but I don't want them flat, because that means there's no business for us. And I suppose that if you think of a changing landscape, it just means that there are opportunities for people who want to do things differently. I mean, if I had to give one, it's not really a criticism. I think it's more just an observation. The luxury business is meant to appear like they just float above everything. When you walk into a boutique, you're supposed to assume that everything in there was made like, by elves and fairies in the magical forest and sprinkled with, the magic dust at the end, right? But that's just not how it works. And so just because they almost have to, they have to be disconnected, right? And I think that's, what you're saying, Alon, before about everything's always up. But I don't think that's the case anymore. I think that consumer tastes are changing. I think that there's a much more educated population about watches out there now than there was before. They're going to have different expectations. They're going to want to buy differently. They're going to want to buy different products. And I don't think the industry is going to disappear, but I do think that it will look very different in 5 years' time than it does now. So I'd say one word is, or two words really, is influx. What do you think?
I'm not going to respond to what you said, because I find it interesting and kind of concur. Just shooting out an emotion as well. I think that the current feelings about the landscape are negative. And I think there is denial going on. And that links into the second part of Max's question. Do you see brands' lack of reaction and downturn as a sign? Yes. They are, I call it ostrich strategy. Stick your head in the sand and hope the storm will pass. So I see fear, and when that happens, or when you're attacked, you can do three things, right? You can freeze, flee, or fight. So the three Fs. And it's often that these brands choose for freeze, or actually maybe not rationally, but that's their reaction. They definitely are not going to admit that it goes bad. They try to mask the stink with perfume, because we've just discussed what the big groups have published, and that's what we see at the top. Because imagine that if the super wealthy, super healthy Rolex, LVMH, and Swatch Group, and probably Richemont, are suffering that hardcore, it's double digit, and not just 10.1%, right? Or 11. It's 20 plus. Imagine if you go down the pipeline, or if you go down the pyramid, how much blood is running through the streets. So the industry as a whole is suffering like crazy. But what changes are being made? I don't see that many. So will their ignorance be the reason for further downfall in the future, as Max states or asks? I think so. What are your 2 cents on that particular question or topic, David?
I totally agree. The watch industry, has been through just so much. I don't see any of these large brands disappearing. I don't see that. But I think, as we've said, the worst is still to come. And I would just say that if you are a consumer, it's a good time for you to shop around. I think, after a couple years of frustration, hopefully you can, save your pennies, or, unload the pennies that you have and get what you want. I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that it is very easy to be cynical about a lot of this stuff. I am very cynical. I mean, that's basically like my reason for being on the show, is I'm the provocateur who provides the dose of cynicism. But at the same time, like, it's fun. Like, I like wearing these things. I like thinking about them. And so I don't necessarily think, I'm trying to think how to put this. Like, I don't want to kick the industry just because I can. Like, what I'm saying is, don't walk into a boutique and pay list if you can get it for 30% somewhere else. Don't do that. But at the same time, if there is something that one can do, like, a constructive Instagram comment on a brand account, or, if you get a chance to talk to an AD and you say, hey, like, you could make the sales experience a little better. I think on the aggregate, all of that will help, because I think, I do believe that when brands hear some of these things enough, it does tend to bubble upwards, and it works better for them because they can do it quietly, right? I mean, you have to it's just like with people, you have to know how to address people. And some people, would rather just be told quietly, address it quietly, and be done with it, right? So I think that one way to voice your discontent is not to pay MSRP if you can get it for 30% off. But I think also, if you're going to do that and get that in return, just try to help out. Constructive criticism, and if enough people do that, I do eventually think that we'll see some changes. But either way, I think, after being abused for a couple of years, do get some of that back. And I know, Alon, it's difficult for me to say that, because I know you're sort of caught in between two landscapes here. But I think as a consumer, if you're looking for a deal, now's the time to get it.
totally agree. And what I don't agree with, you're definitely not cynical. You're critical. And those are very, very essential differences. So for all of you that are critical and are not part of the TRTS network, please join our network. We have an awesome group of like-minded watch nerds. Everybody's equal, everybody's passionate, and everybody's entitled to their own opinion. And we actually love to hear that opinion. So, David, thank you so much. I have had a blast sitting down with you again for an awesome Q&A mailbag episode for all you dear listeners. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode. You can find all our previous episodes on our official website, www.therealtime.show. And you can find us on Instagram via the handle at therealtime.show, which is the same as our URL. If you want to support the show, please subscribe, like, rate it, and obviously share it with your friends. If you have any questions, feedback, and or criticism, critical or skeptical or even pessimistic, but of course also positive, please send us a message. You can also DM us if you want to join the TRTS community. You can reach David on his Instagram handle at DAVAUCHER. Rob, you can find at ROBNUDDS. And me, you can find at Alon Ben Joseph, like my full name. And if you prefer to send us an email, just add our first name to our URL at therealtime.show. Stay sane and keep on ticking.